Oil is absolutely central to Russia's power. It is one of the country's biggest sources of cash, and once it is refined, it becomes the fuel that keeps Russia's war machine running in Ukraine. Without refined oil, Russia suddenly finds itself short of everything from the diesel that drives its tanks, to the gasoline that powers civilian life, the aviation fuel that feeds its jets, and even the lubricants needed to keep vehicles and machinery in working order. When the money from oil exports dries up, Russia also loses the ability to build and maintain much of the equipment that depends on those refined products in the first place. That is exactly what makes the last few days especially painful for Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine. In a brutal double blow to Putin's campaign, Ukraine has once again launched long-range strikes deep inside Russian territory. This time, though, those attacks landed at almost the exact moment that China appeared to step away from Russia, perhaps for good. Let us begin with what Ukraine did. On November 11th, TVP World reported that Ukraine had unleashed a wave of drone and missile strikes the previous night, focusing entirely on Russia's oil infrastructure. Among the targets was the Saratov refinery, which has become something of a favorite for Ukrainian drones in recent months, along with the Osknefteorsk refinery in the Orenburg region. On top of further hits to Russia's already struggling refining capacity, Ukraine also went after occupied Crimea. There, it struck a maritime oil terminal in Feodosia that Russia uses to ship fuel out of the country to what is now only a small and shrinking list of foreign buyers. That detail already hints at the way China is turning its back on Russian oil, but we will return to Beijing's role later in the video. All three Ukrainian strikes matter, though the attack on Saratov exposes Russia's vulnerability in particularly stark ways. In its coverage of the Saratov strike, the Moscow Times reported that the attack, which took place in the early hours of November 11th, was the fifth time this refinery had been hit by Ukraine during the fall alone. Zoom out to the whole of 2025, and Saratov's critical infrastructure has been struck by Ukrainian drones a total of 7 times. It raises an obvious question. What exactly are Russia's air defenses doing if Ukraine can keep landing direct blows on such an important facility again and again? If you listen to Russia's Ministry of Defense, those air defenses are doing their job. On the night of this trio of attacks, the ministry claimed its systems had shot down 37 Ukrainian drones, 8 of them in the Saratov region. This is a familiar pattern. Russia routinely announces large numbers of intercepted drones, then blames any burning refineries on falling debris. This time, it did not even lean on that excuse. Instead, Russian officials simply refused to acknowledge that the Saratov refinery had been hit at all. The regional governor Roman Busargin said only that Ukrainian drones had injured one civilian and shattered windows in several homes. Ukraine's general staff, however, told a very different story. On Telegram, it published a photograph that appeared to show the Saratov refinery itself on fire. The post declared that a series of explosions had been recorded, followed by a massive blaze in the area of the target, and noted that the extent of the damage was still being assessed. So while we do not yet have a precise measure of how badly the refinery was hurt, we do know that Ukrainian drones reached and struck their objective. That matters because Saratov is no minor facility. Ukraine's general staff highlighted that the Saratov plant produces around 20 different refined products, including gasoline, diesel, technical sulfur, and vacuum gas oil. Many of these are used directly to support Russian occupation forces in Ukraine, which means every successful strike on Saratov translates into a weakening of Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations on Ukrainian soil. The Kyiv Independent adds that the refinery processed about 4.8 million metric tons of crude oil in 2023, underlining just how large and vital this plant is to Russia's overall energy system. Ukrainian drones also had to travel a considerable distance to reach Saratov. The refinery is roughly 370 miles east of the current front line in the war. Yet, distance has ceased to be a serious obstacle for Ukraine. Its long-range drones and missiles can now hit targets across almost the entire depth of Russian territory. That brings us to Ukraine's strike in the Orenburg region, which may be even more consequential than the attack on Saratov. The Osknefteorsk refinery appears to be larger still. According to the Kyiv Independent, this facility can process up to 6.6 million tons of crude oil per year. It also produces a wider range of products, more than 30 in total, including gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, kerosene, and various oils. If you combine the capacity of Osknefteorsk with that of Saratov, you get as much as 11.4 million tons of processing power potentially knocked offline in a single night, assuming Ukraine inflicted enough damage to force shutdowns at both plants. The strike on Orenburg marked the second time Ukraine has hit the region's main refinery, suggesting that Kyiv may have established a relatively safe and repeatable aerial corridor to another strategic target deep inside Russia. Ukraine's general staff again moved quickly to head off any Russian attempt to deny or downplay the damage. As with Saratov, it used Telegram to spell out what had happened. In its statement, the General Staff said that as part of efforts to reduce the enemy's offensive potential and complicate the supply of fuel and ammunition to Russian units, Ukrainian defense forces had targeted facilities at the Osknefteorgzintez refinery in the Orenburg region on November 11th. We also have more specific information about what was hit. The General Staff reported that explosions and the fire were recorded at the site, and that according to preliminary data, one of the primary oil processing units, sometimes abbreviated as APU, had been struck. Processing units of this kind are at the heart of any refinery, turning crude into usable products. Hitting one of these in Orenburg and then sharing an image of a huge column of smoke rising over the plant sends a clear message. Ukraine is not just singling out peripheral facilities, it is going after the core systems that make Russian oil valuable. Having delivered this 1-2 punch to Russia's refining capacity, Ukraine then shifted its focus from production to transportation. With refineries burning, Ukrainian forces moved to the infrastructure Russia uses to move fuel out of the country. This is where Feodosia in occupied Crimea enters the story. We do not have as much public data about the Feodosia port complex as we do about the refineries in Saratov and Orenburg, but Ukraine's General Staff laid out the crucial details in the same Telegram post that announced the Saratov operation. It said that JSC Marine Oil Terminal in Feodosia was also hit. This terminal is described as a key hub for shipping fuel and lubricants by sea to the Crimean Peninsula and to the temporarily occupied territories of southern Ukraine. As with the refinery strikes, the full results of the Feodosia attack are still being evaluated, but early reports suggest that Ukraine managed to destroy or damage several storage tanks at the site. It is highly likely that those tanks contained refined fuels that were destined for Russian forces in occupied Ukraine, transported via the Caspian Sea and the wider maritime network. Taken together, the three strikes made for a terrible night for Russian oil. In reality, however, it has been a terrible few months. Ukraine has sharply increased the tempo of its attacks on Russian oil infrastructure recently because it understands that this liquid gold is what keeps Putin's military machine supplied and funded. The attacks on Saratov, Orenburg and Feodosia are just the latest in dozens of strikes that have mauled Russia's refining capacity and are increasingly targeting both stored fuel and the export terminals that move that fuel abroad. Calling the impact of these raids significant hardly does them justice. Economically and militarily, Russia has been suffering an oil shock engineered entirely by Ukraine. On November 11th, analyst Elliot Clark, writing for the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, outlined the scale of the damage. He notes that Ukraine has targeted roughly 55% of Russia's refineries, triggering a steep drop in the revenue Moscow earns from fuel and other refined products. The logic is simple. With so many refineries damaged or shut down, Russia is producing fewer refined products. What it can still refine is increasingly reserved for the military and for domestic needs, leaving far less available for export. As the Moscow Times reports, Russia responded by extending a total ban on gasoline exports and a partial ban on diesel exports on September 30th. Those exports will not resume the way they once did until at least 2026, and that assumes Russia manages to restore its refining capacity to previous levels. Clark lays out short, medium and long-term scenarios for Russia in the face of Ukraine's sustained campaign. In the short term, he argues, Ukraine is highly likely to maintain or even intensify its strikes, while Russian citizens face rising fuel prices at home. That is especially problematic given that Russian fuel prices had already climbed by 11.6% between January and October. Further increases caused by shortages linked to Ukrainian strikes will only deepen public frustration. Over the medium term, Clark says, foreign governments and businesses will naturally look elsewhere for reliable suppliers, since Russia is proving that it cannot guarantee stable deliveries of fuel. Selling cheap oil does little good if you have nothing left to sell. That is also where we see another hint of the blow China is delivering to Russia. In the long term, Clark believes, these pressures will continue, assuming Ukraine keeps up the pace of its strikes on refineries and storage facilities, as it has since August. And there is little reason to think Kyiv will slow down. Ukraine is producing long-range drones by the thousands, and Russia's air defenses have repeatedly failed to stop them. Chatham House adds that continued attacks on Russian oil infrastructure may offer Ukraine its best way of countering Moscow's strategy of hammering Ukraine's own energy system. On November 10th, the think tank argued that these strikes are essentially Ukraine responding to Russian pressure with pressure of its own.
That pressure is being felt inside Russia.
Chatham House reports that Crimea and several other regions have already experienced gasoline shortages. The Kremlin is under pressure to keep prices stable, both to limit public anger and to prevent people from questioning the purpose of the war itself. To do that, Moscow is paying subsidies to oil companies to compensate them for diverting fuel that would normally be exported back into the domestic market. The bottom line is clear. Ukraine's attacks on the oil sector are costing Putin dearly. That gives Kyiv every incentive to continue. Even before the latest strikes, Putin would have been smarting from the scale of Ukraine's campaign. His one remaining comfort might have been that Ukraine was mainly going after refined products. Crude oil, while not completely safe, still exists in vast quantities inside Russia. That means Moscow can, in theory, keep selling large volumes of unrefined crude to foreign buyers who can process it themselves. That strategy has helped keep money flowing into Russia throughout the war. Interfax reports that in 2024, Russia earned roughly $189 billion from the export of oil and oil products, selling about 7.6 million barrels per day in spite of Western sanctions. For the Kremlin, more of the same might have seemed like enough to sustain its revenues, but of that 7.6 million barrels per day, around 3.5 million barrels were going to India and China. That is where Beijing now steps forward to deliver the second half of this double blow. On November 11th, Newsweek reported that Chinese refiner Yanchang Petroleum, backed by a provincial government, had decided to cease all purchases of Russian crude. Although there has been no formal public announcement, several anonymous traders familiar with the company's plans say that the decision to cut Russian oil is effectively final. United 24 Media followed up by pointing out that Yanchang Petroleum processes roughly 348,000 barrels of oil per day, giving it an annual refining capacity of about 127 million barrels. Of that total, around 26 million barrels make up the firm's yearly import quota. For Russia, this likely means that the equivalent of 26 million barrels in potential crude sales has just vanished. It is the last kind of news Putin wants to hear, as two of his refineries and one of his ports are left burning by Ukrainian drones and missiles. Worse still, the Yanchang story comes on top of earlier reports that several Chinese state-owned oil majors had already suspended purchases from two of Russia's biggest energy companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. We have discussed those suspensions and their implications in a separate video, which you can watch if you want more detail. After months of watching Putin talk about ceasefires and peace deals while simultaneously escalating his war on Ukraine, Trump has started to make good on his threats. One of those threats was to tighten sanctions on Russian oil, and the United States did exactly that on October 22nd. As the BBC reported, Washington introduced what Trump called tremendous new sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. The measures marked the first major direct move by the Trump administration in 2025, suggesting that Putin's refusal to compromise over Ukraine has pushed the US president to act. By targeting these two giants, Trump also sent a very clear signal to buyers of Russian oil, including China. The message was simple. If you keep buying from Russia, you will face severe financial consequences. China appears to have taken that warning seriously, which explains why so many of its companies are now backing away from Russian crude. As the BBC noted, Trump has urged China and India to halt Russian oil purchases entirely and to seek alternative suppliers, possibly at higher prices. Refusing to comply risks exposing these countries and their firms to secondary US sanctions. China has no desire to become entangled in the fallout from such penalties. Even the steep discounts Russia offers on its crude no longer seem attractive enough when weighed against the danger of being cut off from the American financial system. Yanchang Petroleum's move provides further evidence of this shift. The company has launched a tender for new deliveries covering the period from December through mid-February. The very existence of that tender signals that Yanchang is actively looking for replacement suppliers. Previously, Russia shipped plenty of crude to this refiner. Newsweek suggests that Yanchang typically received one cargo of Russian oil each month. Walking away from those shipments is likely to cost Russia many millions, if not billions of dollars over time. These sorts of decisions, repeated across different firms and sectors, are precisely what will erode Putin's already shrinking war chest. As the BBC notes, Russian crude has accounted for almost 20% of China's energy imports. In one sense, that has been good for Russia, giving Putin the impression that Beijing had become heavily dependent on his oil and would struggle to break away. But the other side of that statistic is that around 80% of China's energy imports already come from non-Russian sources. That means Beijing has more options than Putin might like to admit. Yanchang's decision is even more striking because it comes at a time when Russia is becoming increasingly desperate to find buyers for its crude. On November 6, Reuters reported that Russia's Urals crude was trading at its widest discount to Brent crude in about a year. The price gap between the two grades had widened to roughly $4 per barrel, up from a previous spread of about $2. If you apply that $4 discount to 26 million barrels, you get potential annual savings of about $104 million for a buyer choosing Urals over Brent. That is a huge sum for any company, yet Yanchang appears ready to forego those savings, and it is doing so almost entirely because of Trump's sanctions and the risk calculations they have created. Putin will be hoping that China eventually comes back into line. That is not impossible. There is a sense that Beijing is waiting to see how its broader relationship with the United States develops before deciding whether to resume large-scale purchases of Russian crude. If relations deteriorate sharply, Chinese companies might once again lean on discounted Russian oil. Trump seems to recognize this possibility, and he moved to shape China's incentives about 2 weeks before Yanchang's decision. His tool of choice was tariffs, or more precisely, the reduction of them. On October 30th, NBC News reported that Trump met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Trump described the meeting as a 12 out of 10, and announced that the United States would immediately cut its tariff on fentanyl-related Chinese goods from 20% to 10%. Other tariffs remain in place, as NBC noted, but Trump's strategy is clear. By offering to ease or remove tariffs, Washington is trying to nudge China toward a choice. Which matters more to Beijing, cheap Russian oil or a smoother trade relationship with the United States? Judging by the growing list of Chinese firms suspending or ending purchases of Russian crude, it seems that Beijing currently prefers to move in the direction of lower tariffs. If that trend continues, it could spell disaster for Putin's war in Ukraine. Every further step the US takes to reward China for what Trump views as good behavior will likely cost Russia billions of dollars in lost oil revenue each year. Crude that Russia is already struggling to refine because of Ukrainian strikes will not even be sellable at the same scale. The pressure on Putin will only increase. On November 11th, Russia's leader was forced to absorb this double shock. Within the space of 24 hours, Ukraine destroyed or damaged more of his country's refining and export infrastructure, while China signaled that it is stepping back from Russian oil. If current trends continue, these blows could be just the beginning of something far more devastating for the Kremlin. As Putin confronts what must feel like betrayal from his most important partner, he also faces growing acts of resistance at home. Russian citizens themselves are looking for ways to undermine and sabotage his war machine. If you want to learn more about how ordinary Russians are trying to cripple Putin's ability to wage war, make sure to watch our other video on that subject. And if you found this analysis useful, remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more in-depth coverage of Russia's collapsing oil economy and the broader war in Ukraine. Thank you for watching.